And thank you for the awesome but very embarrassing intro, referencing my Highland dancing past that no one really knows about. All right, is everyone ready to nerd out? Yes. Can I get a more energy in this audience right now? Everyone ready to nerd out? Yes, okay. Nerd out over forms. Lots of applause, so it's obvious that we're at a tech conference. So who here has designed, built, or filled out a form in the last month of your life? Okay, the vast majority of this audience. So I think a lot of us probably have this like love-hate relationship with forms, right? They're a necessary evil, but they don't have to be evil, and that's kind of where the gist of my talk is going to come from today. So today we're going to talk about a formative lesson in inclusivity for the world's most love-hate/beloved UI pattern. There's going to be a lot of form puns, so my apologies in advance. But let's get it rolling. So a bit of a brief intro to me. This is my professional LinkedIn-esque intro. I came into technology as a student at HackerU's front-end development bootcamp. So I like to call myself a recovering front-end developer. Soon after graduating from HackerU, I kind of fell back in love with my first love, which was design. So transitioned into kind of a more like UX and product design style role at a consultancy here in Toronto called TWG. And it was over a number of years spent there that I worked in a lot of financial technology spaces, dabbled a little bit in insurance and health technology, which kind of led me to where I am now at League, designing a lot of forms for an insurance industry kind of benefits, health and wellness space. So lots of experience designing forms over a large number of industries. And like was introed, if you want to get a massage at some point today, if you're feeling really stressed after this conference talk, I know I will be. And so, yeah, feel free to go grab a massage in the B-side room that League has generously provided for us. So here are some different ways that I identify. I identify as a woman, a hand letterer, a product design leader, community builder, abuser of expletives, and recovering front-end developer. So this is my disclaimer for saying there's going to be a lot of swear words in this talk. I apologize in advance. Swear words and puns are kind of two of my favorite things, so that's going to be a theme of this presentation. But really, what got me excited about this topic was this kind of intersection between accessibility, inclusivity, diversity, and all the spaces between. And these are, if you look at my Twitter bio, it's essentially mostly tweets about design, accessibility, inclusivity, so this talk is essentially a hybrid of some of my favorite things. And I really think it's important for us to recognize the responsibility, the immense responsibility we have as digital creators, people who are making kind of micro decisions about products on a daily basis. Because essentially we as software developers and designers are basically like digital urban planners of sorts. We have a really big impact on the digital neighborhoods that we build, whether we're building them through forms or marketing or e-commerce websites or a software platform, a new product. We have a really big responsibility to make sure these neighborhoods are built with intention and impact and thoughtfulness right from the start. And that's where forms come in. So when it comes to forms, we have a responsibility to make these neighborhoods really safe and inclusive for all. And today I want to talk about some strategies for how we can do that and who we need to consider when we're creating these spaces for a broad and diverse group of people, the people that we're building for every day, beyond the tech community. So it's our responsibility to design spaces where everyone feels welcome. And my goal today is not to talk about CSS3 or HTML5 or any kind of code snippet that you're going to bring into your work on Wednesday, but rather something that you think about, that you come to the table with when you're performing in your craft every single day. And that's kind of a focus on inclusion as part of your core kind of toolkit as a creator in these digital industries. So here's what I got planned for us today. We're going to do a bit of an informative history. Told you there would be puns. We'll chat about universal form design and what does that mean? How can we employ that in our work on the daily? Obviously, we'll talk about some best-in-class examples and some worst-in-class examples, some of which I'm ashamed to say I have created myself, but we're going to talk about the learnings from them. And then some key takeaways that my hope is that you'll take these kind of key principles with you back to work on Wednesday. All right, an informative history. Where did forms come from? They're a really kind of rudimentary UI pattern. They're nested into a lot of the applications that we use on a daily basis. And forms really originated from this guy, Charles Babbage. He's kind of known as the father of forms and the father of computing. And Charles Babbage is an English polymath, inventor, scientist, mathematician, engineer, and he invented forms as a means of ingesting large amounts of information. Ingesting and systematizing data and returning it in a form that people could draw conclusions from and use for different things. But Charles created the form as kind of a means of efficiency, a means of gathering large amounts of information and processing it at rapid speeds. So it's no surprise that this efficiency came at the cost of our humanity in some cases. For many people, form input fields can really make us think about the decisions that we're making. Say, on an insurance application, for example, you're basically like laying out your entire life on a form for some unknown third party to come in and say whether or not you are eligible for a house over time. So there's a lot of humanity that is missing from these forms. In recent years, too, we've seen a lot of emergence of natural language forms and really talking about, like, hi, my name is Andrea versus first name Andrea, last name Crofts. And that is a progression in the right direction. But still, forms as a UI unit are not the most humane kind of UI pattern. So how can we make them better? But first, let's talk about why or how forms could have a really negative impact on someone's life. So usability of forms, both digital and kind of printed versions like these you often see in passport information, or passport applications rather. Poor usability in these forms could really cost someone either their mobility or even their citizenship if questions aren't asked correctly, if they're not providing the right information. And so creating the right conditions where people can submit their information is really important. Similarly, in the insurance industry, which is the space that I operate in on the daily, and a couple of my colleagues are here as well, it could cost someone thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket insurance expenses if your form isn't formatted correctly, isn't distributable, isn't editable digitally. So it's no surprise that at League, we've taken a lot of these kind of more physical forms and brought them into a digital context, because then we have the luxury of going through validation and things like that, which basically tailor our responses at every step and make sure that we're filling things out to the best of our knowledge so that we're not paying out of pocket for large insurance expenses. And this is especially important in the United States, where a lot of healthcare coverage isn't subsidized by the government. So I think we can all agree that insurance pretty much sucks. Am I right? I see a lot of head nods. And this is the exact reason why I decided to kind of bring my craft into the insurance space. Like I said, I had worked in financial technology for a little while, and really kind of saw insurance as a barrier in some cases between people getting access to care. And I wanted to break down that barrier as much as possible, which is why I ended up here at League. And one of the really lucky things about my job that I get to do is a lot of usability research and generative research, so essentially just talking to people about their experiences with insurance, how they think about their health and wellness, and a lot of different themes. And the prevailing sentiment that we get out of these interviews looks something like this. Anything to do with health insurance is generally terrible. And when I say that most people have this sentiment, I've been keeping track over time of all the interviews that I've done, and statistically, over 95% of people feel this prevailing sentiment, and probably many of you here today do as well. My little caveat at the bottom here is note that they're not saying this about League, because we really want to change this industry for the better and partner with the giants to increase, again, our sense of responsibility of how important it is to make these spaces inclusive, accessible, and usable for all. So insurance is a really powerful time because it's a formative time when people consider their identity. If you're thinking about when you fill out insurance forms, it's probably typically when you start a new job. And during that process, you're sitting there at your desk and you're thinking, like, who am I going to fill out as a beneficiary? What is a beneficiary? What is a life insurance policy? Who statistically should I be giving my money to? Someone who, like my mom or my brother? There's a lot of micro decisions that come into this process at this very formative time that make people think about that, concepts of who should I give my life insurance policy to, but also concepts of gender and identity and things that just aren't really black and white. So I take this responsibility, I don't take it lightly, which is why I'm up here talking to you today about some of the learnings that we've had designing forms for inclusivity. So universal form design. We talk a lot about universal design as kind of that intersection of inclusivity and accessibility and making sure that the things that we're building are accessible, available, and universal for the broadest number of people we can possibly make them for. And so universal form design effectively takes diversity, the diversity of our broad population, which is a fact. It's a fact that our society nowadays is really diverse in terms of race, socioeconomic status, gender, and a number of other dimensions. But it's a choice that we make as digital creators and a responsibility to include the most number of people in this process. So inclusion is a choice that we make every day when we're designing these kind of micro interactions and forms and choosing between like a yes/no binary radio button input versus a multi-select option. So I'll get to some more examples further in my talk about how we can do this better. But just remember that inclusion is a choice and diversity is a fact, so how can we make the right choice? Spoken very eloquently by our very handsome Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Much more handsome than Trump, let's be real. So it's important in this context that we're thinking of a lot of these inputs in terms of spectrums rather than binaries. Again, if we want to be representative of the broader population doesn't operate in terms of binaries. It operates in terms of spectrums. And there's no area that is more ripe for disruption and improvement, frankly, than the typical gender, male, female form input on a form. So I'll get to some more examples in a bit. But for any of you who have been to some of my previous talks, you know that this is kind of like a formative part of the conversation. So we're going to do a bit of an exercise. I'm going to ask you now to close your eyes. Awesome. There's still a few of you with your eyes open. I can see all of you. All right. Now think of something you've been struggling with for your whole life. This is something that's unresolved, yet it really fundamentally defines who you are. Now imagine you're filling out a form and you come face to face with that struggle. How does that make you feel in that moment? What lived experiences are kind of flashing before your eyes, maybe reminding you of times where you didn't feel good enough, or that your representation of your identity in some way, shape, or form didn't fit the reality of society? So now open your eyes. I want to bring this back to the conversation of forms because forms are a really powerful reminder of identity. Similar to that moment you just had where you sat there thinking about this thing that was really fundamental to your being, this is often a similar experience that people have when they're filling out forms and they don't identify with one of the binary options presented to them. And gender, for many people, is one of those struggles. So imagine being told in that process of filling out a form that the gender you identify with is not a valid option. That lived experience of yours is coming back full throttle at this time where you're meant to really kind of ease your identity into a couple of predefined options without the ability to provide more information. So Alex Verman, who authored a piece in a publication called Them, which is a publication by Condé Nast that essentially shares the stories of LGBTQ plus communities. And Alex wrote a really chilling article in Them, which I really recommend that you all read. And it was about that process of kind of transitioning hormonally through that transgender surgery. And so Alex mentioned, how do you embody a category of experience that many people don't even believe exists? When it's not prevalent in society, it's really hard to kind of create that unique representation of your identity for yourself when it isn't one that is kind of prevalent in society. Alex went on to say, how do you make sense of your body and how it's changing when all available narratives feel too gendered to apply? And this is that really formative struggle that many of you each have your own kind of definitions of that comes about in these pivotal moments when you're filling out forms. So Alex chronicles the struggle of kind of going through hormone replacement therapy and seeing a gender therapist who was essentially the gateway to their transition as a transgender person. And really painful time in their life that was documented really, really eloquently in this magazine. But it's not all bad. Even slow-to-move institutions like the government are instituting this thinking. So I asked myself, if the government can issue the province's first non-binary birth certificate here in Canada earlier this year, why can't insurance follow suit? And that opened up this whole can of worms, because insurance is a very complex industry. There's a lot of kind of moving pieces that go into micro decisions or macro decisions for some people when it comes to adjudicating claims. So for example, there's an underwriting process that people go through where they're basically having to select themselves as a very binary input. The only inputs that are available in any insurance forms are male and female, and there's often no option to add additional information to those checkboxes. And so this proves as an opportunity for us, if we can't get rid of that pattern right now, what are some ways we can kind of work around it and still make that experience less shitty for people? So a few months ago, when I was really thinking about this deeply, I kept being really insecure about being like a white cisgendered woman wanting to do more of this research, because this wasn't a category of lived experience that that could really resonate with me. So naturally, a good friend of mine told me, well, Dre, like, you interview people all the time. Why don't you talk to these people? Why don't you make sure that you're hearing their voices as part of this conversation? Because naturally, that's the best way to understand that lived experience when it is something different than your own. So myself and one of my designers on my team, Demi, set out to interview about 12 people, each of which had different kind of fell in different spectrums of gender identities, and we learned a lot of stuff. So these were some of the predefined genders, if you're thinking about gender as kind of like a multi-select option. We started with these, thinking we were pretty woke. We were not woke. We learned very quickly that we were not woke. But we started with female, male, transgender, transgender man, transgender woman, gender nonconforming, otherwise referred to as GNC in many circles. But then quickly realized through conversations with people that there were many other terms used to refer to these populations. And in many cases, people didn't identify with any of these. So it became pretty clear to us that we had to provide an option where they could input a custom gender identity or not ask for it at all. So some more that were mentioned were non-binary, agender, genderqueer, queer, intersex, two-spirit, and then when it came to the pronouns that we often think of, he, she, them, there were a couple more that people referred to as well, which were Z and Zer. So we quickly realized that this was our spectrum of knowledge, and we quickly realized that there was much more to learn about, which was a really humbling moment for us, naturally. So we talked to 12 people. Most of them were from the LGBTQ+ communities, but we also talked to some cisgender participants as well, because we wanted to understand how would they react to these new introductions in these form inputs. And so we talked to people across a spectrum of identities. I'll note that for this section, we've removed all identifiable characteristics to protect the participants' confidentiality naturally. So a lot of the quotes are paraphrased, but they are representations of some like very prominently felt feelings in these communities. So one of the prevailing themes we heard was, as people on the fringes, we can tell when we weren't considered in the process. And that's a painful moment to sit there and think, well, did they even talk to one person in our community? Because that one person, that 1 hour-long user research session could have told them a lot that they could have avoided in this initial prototype. Also, another prevailing feeling was some companies approach this very thoughtfully, some are pretty ignorant, and others try but miss the mark. And spoiler alert, we tried, but we missed the mark. But what was beautiful about this was that we were able to put our work in front of a number of people early and often and ask a lot of different questions. So these were all the different ways that we failed, and I'll get to how we kind of pivoted from that in a little bit and some other kind of best-in-class examples. So I'm going to talk about a number of different patterns today. A number of different UI inputs. I've talked a lot about gender, and that's going to be the majority of today's conversation, but there are other culprits where people find themselves kind of asking pivotal questions about their identities when filling out forms. So culprit 1 of 5 is gender. We're going to start here. So we heard from participants the fact that our society often doesn't look beyond male or female doesn't mean the way we identify is invalid. It just means that society isn't able to read us properly. So there was this prevailing belief that we don't prescribe to one of these binary options, but society is the one that's wrong and not us, which I also agree to be true. We also heard the fact that it's an add-on makes it feel like there's a primary path for the general public and a separate path for us. In scenarios like these where we're asking, I mentioned in the insurance context, we have to ask for male or female. But we thought maybe if we asked for additional options about gender identities and pronouns, that we would be creating that space for people if they needed it. So addressing both the cisgender person's need and someone who doesn't fit into that kind of binary identity. And we quickly learned that that was wrong because it really did create kind of two separate paths. Path A for cisgender and path B for those who didn't fit the binary options. Some more things we heard. For banking, insurance, and other old school industries, I expect to have to provide my legal sex, but I like to know why it's required. So this was an interesting insight for us because we learned that as long as we kind of explain why we're asking, I mentioned in the insurance context, we have to know, so we needed to find a respectful way of asking. So instead, we blamed it on our insurance carrier partners, which is really the truth, because we as League don't need to know that for our own purposes, but we do need to know that in collaboration with kind of the older insurance carriers that have been around for a while. And then ensuring that we told them that our team is committed to ensuring that all members feel safe and respected. And if you'd like to tell us more about your gender identity, feel free to use the forms below. And we didn't kind of make them a popover option, but rather one that we placed first and foremost so that even cisgender people could refer to themselves with the pronouns that they wanted to be referred to as. We also heard it's important to not position different sexual orientations and identities as an other option, but as one option among many different categories. So this was a common pattern that I saw when I was looking up different approaches to gender forms, was this ominous other option. Like if we have to ask, we should give them an option to select something other than the primary prevailing two. And this was really problematic because it quite literally othered people. It made them feel as though they weren't part of that prevailing narrative, and they also weren't able to provide more information about what other meant to them. So this was by far the most problematic option of all, even in advance of just the gender male-female, rather. So now we're getting into some better examples. You're probably wondering at this point, but like, what's the right way? And there really is no right way to approach this. It really depends on the needs of your organization. So that's why I'm giving kind of some general examples that you can kind of figure out why you need to know this information and what are some different ways that you can ask, because it's different for every company based on the information you need to be collecting. So we heard from this user, it's important to provide a multi-select option to select the multiple ways that one might identify. For example, someone could be transgender and a woman at the same time, and maybe another option where they want to kind of clarify even further. So this multi-select was a really great way of kind of listing out some of the prevailing identities and providing other options, which also doubles as another intake method to be able to learn about kind of some of these different gender dimensions as they evolve over time. This is a funny one. I take some kind of perverse pleasure from using the prefer not to say option. It's messing up their data collection, and I don't care because they didn't consider me. So this is kind of like the anarchy perspective, right? Like, I'm so tired of this shit. And so I'm definitely going to use this prefer not to say, and I'm definitely not going to use the other. Although this definitely is not the worst option. As you can see, you can add additional dimensions to other. But I've often seen this kind of come up in forms for registration for conferences and different like type forms in Google Forms, and people are just kind of creating these from scratch. This is kind of the way of saying, like, we want to understand your community, but we don't really, but we're trying. And so this is definitely not the worst way, but most definitely not the best way as well. Having a list of identities creates a perennial problem because you're always going to be missing something. I like when I can add more details myself. So at first we had kind of a drop-down list like this of a number of different identities, and we quickly changed to something like this where we just at least had a custom option. And that custom option gave us the ability to capture more information as we went. But then we quickly learned, based on the multi-select example, that it was the best way to do it was add a multi-select and a custom option as well, plus a list of the most kind of prevalent gender identities. So we learned through this project that sex and gender are very much not the same thing. And I mean, I knew this beforehand, but it became much more clear talking to these people that when it came to naming this input, it was, the prevailing way to name it in the United States is sex. In Canada, it was gender. But I thought, like, there must be a better way. There must be a different alternative to sex and gender. And in the end, we ended up finding identity. But identity doesn't map one-to-one with the insurance form's gender or sex in the States. And so that was a bit complicated to kind of map back and forth, and we're still working on that internally. But identity was by far the most prevailing kind of best case solution to this particular input. We learned that sex was very biological, and that a lot of transgender people in particular they understood that they had to provide like a sex assigned at birth, for example, because it was pretty, it was biological. It was just part of their humanity, how they were born, whereas gender was much more complicated because it was performative. Gender is a lot more about like the way that you show up in the world, and we all show up in the world very differently. We see that in the way we all dress differently. We each kind of have our own unique style to us, and gender is very similar. It's not something that you kind of like put on and express to the world. It's something that you really feel like you are. And one of our users said, from my knowledge of queer and trans theory, gender is performative. It's not just about how you feel inside, it's about how you make your way in the world. So with that said, gender as a field was definitely a very complicated aspect. And so we did this research, but we also wanted to pair it with secondary research that we found in the community. And I don't know about you, but I've read a lot of Medium articles. And this is by far the best Medium article that I have ever read. And I highly recommend it. I send it to so many people. It's written by Sabrina Fonseca, who is a creator, and she's worked primarily in advertising, kind of transitioned over to software. And so a lot of her examples are very software focused. But she talks about kind of this notion that a little question is a really big deal when it comes to shaping people's experiences with your product. So she asks, how do we ask people for their gender in a very thoughtful and respectful way? So a number of the examples that I'm going to provide in this next section are from different companies all over the world that are doing this and kind of using their respective business objectives to kind of craft what the right version of gender is for them. And Facebook is a good example. So I don't know about you, but when it comes to patterns like this, I often reference the behemoth tech companies because they have a seemingly endless amount of resources to explore these opportunity areas in their products. So Facebook asks for male, female, but then allows a custom option. And then there's this kind of type ahead section here as well. When they're typing transgender, for example, it kind of starts to give them multiple options within that, but then they can add different kind of spectrums of identities as you go. And this is a really powerful option because not only have they given the custom option, but they've also asked for a preferred pronoun. And not only did they ask for a preferred pronoun, but they also kind of explained how that pronoun would be used in context in their application. So often when you're being referred to by another kind of user on the app. And so this also goes one step further to explain kind of how this will appear on your profile and how public it is. So for example, people who maybe aren't really wanting their parents to see that they're going through this transition process yet, or there are people in their life that they don't really feel would adapt to this in a positive way, so they can set that security preference as well in context to this input, because Facebook has realized that this is a pretty sensitive part of people's identities, a really kind of intimate choice they're making here to share this information with the world. So it's their right to figure out who they want to share this with. Another example, and I often look to different organizations within the trans community for kind of the best-in-class examples of these forms. So this is an example from the Trevor Project, where they ask for a number of different dimensions of both gender and sexual orientation. They also ask for preferred pronouns and give another option in addition to the list that they provided here. Another great organization to look at is My Trans Health, and they do a lot lot of amazing work in the United States that's primarily geared towards making sure that trans communities are finding the right types of care in their respective cities. So finding a list of doctors, for example, that have been used by the transgender community, and it's a really kind of powerful way to look at the ways that these different companies have approached this opportunity area. So to sum up gender, obviously we know that the options on the left, kind of the binary radio button of female and male, and then the even more abrasive female, male, and other, are not the right ways to explore this problem. But some of the best options are this kind of multi-select alternative with the ability to add other. And then I mentioned a little bit earlier as well, calling this section identity rather than gender or sex. So you don't have to choose by between one of the lesser evils, for example. Okay, now we're going to go through culprit 2 of 5, which is citizenship. And we talked to people naturally who were from a diverse variety of communities, and so we talked to some folks who weren't Canadian citizens rather. So they had this gut visceral reaction to this question of, are you a Canadian citizen, yes or no? Really bothered them because it really kind of created a dichotomy of like citizens versus non-citizens. So again, similar to the gender options, providing a number of different options, whether it's kind of visa submitted or waiting on permanent residency or permanent resident, but any number of permutations that would kind of be a bit more about the legal status in Canada rather, as opposed to, are you a Canadian citizen, yes or no? Another one is form fields, and this often comes to play when we're designing forms for responsive web, when we kind of scale our large form inputs down from desktop to tablet and then to mobile, which is the biggest culprit, and not using kind of more dynamic font sizing methods like Ms and Rems to bring down that text size. But what we see often in those patterns is when you're using really, really long names, and this is obviously a very, very long name, but to break form inputs by using names that are from different cultures is something that we should all be kind of doing when we're testing or QAing our designs, and especially in code before we ship our products. So a friend of mine in this community, he does a lot of amazing diversity work, Mohammed. He posted this on Twitter a little while ago, kind of highlighting to Envision, which is a design prototyping tool that probably a number of you use, that their craft library, which is a library that's used to kind of take dynamic names and input it into design mocks to make sure that you're kind of testing your inputs with a variety of different names. He made the distinction and showed it's very clear here as well that a lot of these are very kind of North American names, and they didn't explore other alternatives in this process either. So I kind of created a list of names that I use to bulletproof form inputs to make sure that they're wide enough. And of course, some of these are in different characters. We have Chinese in here, we even have Sanskrit. But what's important to note is these names help you test a number of things. Does your font actually support these characters? Are your form fields actually allowing for an overflow option, or are they scaling appropriately, or can you wrap to a different line? But they provide a lot of opportunity to make sure that we're testing our applications for different names. And then he also made a joke. Muhammad is the most common name in the world. Ask me how I know. Another option, so a lot of us here in the room are designers and developers. We're the people that are creating these forms at the kind of micro level, the form level. But for those of you who maybe aren't kind of at that final decision-making point, but still have access to your Slack profiles, admin settings, you can go in and create a new field for different profiles, for example. And there's a great example here from Patreon that Erica Joy tweeted about. She says, does your company have custom fields in their Slack profiles? If yes, what are they? And Patreon had name pronunciation and pronoun preference, which is a really good place to start. So naturally, we integrated that at League as well. My preferred name is not Andrea, it's Dre, because it sounds so much cooler and you can't forget about Dre. So this is a perfect opportunity to have my preferred name in here as well. And in addition to that, my gender pronouns, because it creates, it reduces a lot of that awkward kind of interaction when you call someone by a pronoun that they don't identify with. And security questions. So security questions are often things like, what was your childhood nickname or the name of your first pet, for example? And in some cultures, a lot of people don't identify with these concepts at all. For example, I did some usability testing a while ago with a Chinese participant, and they didn't identify with any of the pre-selected options available that we had given them in this fintech application we were building. And that was a wake-up moment for me where I was like, well, why do we even ask these? Why don't we just allow people to create their own? And it also doubles as a security opportunity to make more secure security questions. So my friend Amelia says, hey, internet, if you force me to answer your idiotic security questions, you basically guarantee I won't remember the answer. Let me make my own security. So a simple thing, but again, it's simple, but it has a really big impact, similar to that ability to add kind of an other option and clarify in the gender or identity section. So an example of basic is the one that you probably come to know and love hate. And then the best-in-class example here is the ability to write their own question. So in summary, we're wrapping it up. We got some key takeaways that you can take with you in your minds and in your hearts when you're creating products after today's conference and tomorrow and beyond. So when you're thinking about what you're asking your participants, what you're asking people to fill out in these different forms, ask yourself, do we even need to collect this information? And this could be a good opportunity to take a form that has been built on over time at your company and take it to marketing, take it to legal, take it to product, and kind of understand like how are we using all this information? Let's say you work at a social networking platform and you're asking for gender. Why do you need to know that? Is that for demographic purposes? Because as we know, demographic purposes can be problematic when we have security breaches and people's information is leaked all over the internet. So it even has kind of a double benefit of making sure that you're only collecting the information you need so that you're not releasing sensitive information out into the world inadvertently, but still it's a risk. Another opportunity to ask yourself, especially right now, is should we start collecting more information? Now that there's more of an emphasis on, of course, like creating more inclusive and diverse environments on the web, should we start asking for gender pronouns? Can we kind of all agree to start making that a thing and using that information in our products to refer to our customers? So this is a good kind of watershed moment where we're asking ourselves these questions. But having that conversation with the powers that be, as I mentioned, legal, marketing, sales, et cetera, and asking if we can start integrating this into our product in different ways. Because if we don't have it, we can't integrate it. So let's start collecting it. And then talk to people. Inclusion is work, but it simply requires regular conversations, regular touch points with people whose experiences are very different from your own. So talk to people. It's really important. And then QA your own shit. Test your inputs with a variety of cross-cultural names. Feel free to use the list that I provided. I'll tweet it out afterwards. And use this as an opportunity to make sure that you're not making someone feel othered because their name doesn't fit in the input box on your responsive web kind of mobile view. And then this is something that I didn't mention earlier, but I think is probably the most important thing for you to take away today. Explain why you need to know. And this comes from that conversation you had earlier with legal, because then you understand like why you need to know this information. So you can take that conversation that you had with legal, bring it into a tooltip or a kind of contextual text helper, and explain to your user why you're asking. Because in many cases, they don't mind giving it to you, even if it's a bit sensitive. But if you need to know because you need to administer their benefits or give them a loan or a mortgage, then that's something that they're probably going to be willing to do. They just need to understand kind of why you need to know it. And you need to be kind of more sensitive in the way that you ask it and respectful, of course. So that's all I got for you. I got time for a couple of questions, of course. But before we jump into Q&A, you can talk to me on Twitter. Feel free to email me if you have kind of encountered similar hurdles in your products and want to know kind of where we netted out with this stuff. I can't share it publicly, which is why I've shared snippets. And if you want kind of an overview of my talk, my slides, all the resources that I mentioned, I have this fancy little link on my website that has all that information there for you. So, questions? At the very back. Yeah, no, exactly. That's a really great question. I think the question was essentially like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did we decide to make these changes, or did these changes kind of happen upon us? I think that's why I mentioned one of those points around like asking ourselves, should we start collecting more information? Because when we were preparing these prototypes for testing, we had a number of people asking us, mostly developers, but like we can't even use this information. We have no way of storing it right now. What are we going to use it for? We don't often refer to people in the third person in this way within our application, and so a lot of these questions started coming up. But then the question of ethics came into play, and like, do we want to be a progressive insurance company? We already are. Let's kind of own this, take it, and run with it as our responsibility. And of course, it's going to require us to kind of treat our data modeling and the design of our infrastructure a little bit differently. But it's worth it to make our clientele feel really respected and heard in this process. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. One more question, right here. Yeah.
And I guess just I'm wondering, one of your slides was about, do we even need to ask? And I'm wondering, as a person who's constantly like wondering, can I please take this little, input element out of here or not? I'm just wondering if you've had any positive experiences in your role as a tech and a creative, getting like, enacting change of that sort, like getting the input field off of the form.
Great question.
Yeah,
the question was, have I had any positive experiences enacting change when it came to inputs that had been there since the dawn of time, and I'm kind of advocating to remove? I would say, in all honesty, I'm still in that process right now. This research was something that we started maybe 2 months ago, and we're still kind of figuring out how to make the wheels move on this. But in all honesty, bringing in pronouns in our Slack profiles and really kind of socializing the importance of this stuff really does help too, because then you're not just saying like, we need this input, but we can now say like, this is why it's important to all these people that we've interviewed, and we've seen really positive adoption for this in our Slack channels as well, and making people feel like they really understand how people prefer to be identified. So there's like this narrative that has to happen, I think, before you have that conversation. But once you do and you kind of get the wheels moving, I'm in that phase right now where I'm like very optimistic about how things can change. And we've already found ways to kind of work around it. So I think the biggest victory for me so far is getting people having these conversations and talking about this, because that leads to change. If you can't get everyone on board. Yes, people internally in the company that I work for. Yeah. Cool. Thank you all so much. You've been the best audience.